Good morning. I'm Geoff Shepard, and I have the privilege of helping to produce the Nixon Legacy Forums. For those of you who keep track, this is our 29th such forum. They are co-sponsored by the Richard Nixon Foundation and the National Archives. And the theory is they are group oral histories that bring together the people who helped do initiatives for the Nixon administration to discuss the documents that future scholars and researchers will find when they come to do research on the administration among the 42 million pages of documents that are at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California. To put these into context, what we have discovered in the various topics that we have done is they fall into certain categories. And this particular category for today, we call President Nixon as the architectural president. And what it focuses on in this series are the major changes that occurred in the executive office of the president under the leadership of Richard Nixon, when the National Security Council was revitalized under Henry Kissinger, the Domestic Council was created under John Ehrlichman, the Office of Management and Budget came into being from the old Bureau of the Budget under George Shultz, who's with us today, and the function of the Chief of Staff under Bob Haldeman changed considerably, all because of the way President Nixon wanted to run the executive office of the president. Then within those four categories, what we're focusing on today is the Office of Management and Budget, and this is really the third in a series of our forums that are basically devoted to the Office of Management and Budget. We did one that focused on the Ash Council and how it suggested this new organization be structured. We have one scheduled. It was supposed to occur in April and it got postponed, that focuses on three people who were career civil servants at the old Bureau of the Budget to talk about their view of the beginning of the Office of Management and Budget. And then today, which is the third in this series, we have the presidential appointees who help to run the Office of Management and Budget. And what we're going to do within that context is have each of them discuss for a few minutes how they got to those positions, and then we'll come back and go into detail about what they did when they were in charge. I should also add, we're here today at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and we are in the Annenberg Conference Room, which was designed by George Shultz in 2005, precisely for programs like this. So our three people immediately to my right is Fred Malek, and next to him is George Shultz, and then Ken Dam. But we're going to start with first in time being first in right, and we'll show you that on this slide, the timeline of the management of OMB. Now, Robert Mayo was the first director of the Bureau of the Budget, and he served for about a year and a half. But when OMB came into existence in July of 1970, the first director was George Shultz, and his deputy was Cap Weinberger. And then George left to become Secretary of the Treasury. Cap became director of OMB, and he brought Frank Carlucci to be his deputy. And then after the president was reelected in 1972, Roy Ash assumed leadership of OMB with Fred Malek, who's with us today, as his deputy. So we start with a picture, and this is a picture of you, George, and John Ehrlichman with the president. Could you tell us how you got to OMB and what they told you to talk you into doing it?
Well, I became aware early on that President Nixon was interested in the process of governance. And he understood that there was a difference between campaigning, which in a sense is an act of dividing people, and governance, which is a process of including people.
And you were in his campaign?
I supported him both times, but I was asked through Arthur Burns to chair one of the task forces that he created during the campaign. And the task force on particular subjects mine was wage, price, labor issues. And the idea was that these task forces would report after the election. And they would be, of course, compatible with views he'd taken, but nevertheless much more spelled out as things that he could use in the process of governance. And so I did one of those, and in the process got to know him more. I'd known him slightly during the Eisenhower administration. But I could see this interest in governance and interest in strategy. So I first was Secretary of Labor, and I could see his interest in strategy on many occasions. For example, I was very critical of the Kennedy and Johnson administration's tendency to intervene in big labor disputes on the grounds that they constituted a national emergency. And what that process was doing was causing the process of private bargaining to deteriorate. Because if I know I'm coming to the White House, I'm not going to make my best offer until I get there, right?
Right.
So the process of private bargaining atrophies under those circumstances.
I think you said at the time, if you hold out a welcome sign, people
If
will
the
come.
president hangs out his shingle, he'll get all the business, which he didn't want to get. So there was a strike of the East and Gulf Coast longshoremen that had started the previous October, I think, and President Johnson had declared it would constitute a national emergency. Under Taft-Hartley, he enjoined it. The Supreme Court agreed with him, and the injunction runs out about January 18th or something like that. I'm sworn in as Secretary of Labor on the 21st.
Yes.
And the press all said, okay, Professor Shultz, now you're Secretary of Labor, what are you going to do? And I went to President Nixon, and we had discussed this beforehand, and said, your predecessor was wrong, and the Supreme Court was wrong. This dispute will cause a lot of kerfuffle, particularly in New York City. They think that's a national emergency. It's a city emergency, not national. And if you will hang in and make it clear the dispute is not coming to the White House, once people get that into their minds, I'll be able to mediate it. And we will send a big message that everything isn't coming to the White House. So he went along with that, and he stood up to a lot of pressure. I think the reason was the tactic was connected to a strategy.
Okay.
And I think in governance with President Nixon, at least in my experiences, strategy was what was compelling. And he looked at the old organization of the government and what was working for him in the executive branch. And he agreed with the Ash Council. They counted up, I don't know, 100 people reporting to the president directly, which is impossible, and wanted to consolidate it. And so in what was the old Bureau of the Budget, it became the Office of Management and Budget.
Yes.
And the strategy was to pull in managerial issues into that place and be a place could then report to him, and he'd be able to sort it out managerially again. So it was the implementation of a strategy. That's the thing to bear in mind all the time. Nixon was a strategist.
Okay. I think we can agree. You were a brilliant Secretary of Labor, and
Well,
proceeded
I'm
extraordinarily well. What did they say when they wanted you? Who were they? When they wanted you to take over OMB?
They said, here's this new thing, we'd like you to take it over.
And you said yes.
I said yes, but then it was interesting because, again, it shows President Nixon's strategic thinking about how things work. Because I remember he called me into the Oval Office, and we sat there, and he said, your predecessor, Bob Mayo, who was the first director of the budget, somehow he thought it was his budget. But I always thought it was my budget. So I want to make it clear to everybody. So I am having arranged for you a nice set of offices in the west wing of the White House. There'll be a reception room, a room for your deputy, and a room for you, a big office. And I want you to hold your meetings in that office.
Interesting.
And if you have a group that's bigger, then you can use the Roosevelt room in the White House. But I want people to come to the White House because place has an impact on the way people think of things. That's
Fantastic.
a great insight on his part.
Yes, indeed.
So then people will say, yes, it's the Bureau of the Budget, but it's the president's budget. And the old OMB hands are the Bureau of the Budget. They are very compatible with that. They consider themselves the president's bureaucracy.
And the old saying on location used to be better a cubbyhole in the West Wing than a magnificent office in the old EOB. But you got,
I didn't get a cubbyhole. I got a nice office. Ken and I worked there together. We had a great setup. We were the envy of the West Wing.
oh, I can imagine. Well, that brings us to Ken. You came with George.
No, I did not come with George. George has been in office for some time. I only came later.
Okay.
But I had known George before. We had done a kind of minor student reorganization at the University of Chicago together in order to allow law students and business school students, but particularly law students, to get both degrees in 4 years rather than 5.
Joint degree, MBA, and law degree.
Yes, get degree. Well, they weren't really joint; they were separate degrees.
Okay.
But get both degrees because in both schools, the business school and the law school, there were electives. Why not take advantage of that to make it easier for law students, particularly, to get some business experience?
And you taught at the law school.
I taught at the law school.
George was dean of the business school. Okay.
But this was a managerial insight.
Yes.
I get kids to have a little broader scope.
So in any event, but I didn't get to OMB until 1971.
Uh-huh.
And how that came about was that I was a lawyer, a law student, a law professor, and I had to publish. And I wanted something different to write about rather than commenting on the latest Supreme Court case or whatever. And so I had this concept that there ought to be a course on the law of the executive branch. And it occurred to me I needed to learn something about that because there was very little written about it. And OMB would be a great place to be. So I had my dean write to George and ask whether I could come down and be an intern for a summer so I could actually observe what was going on. And George's response to the dean was, the law school was that, well, I really ought to come to Washington and be an OMB.
He would pay you.
Yeah. And so that's how that happened, and that's why I got there, but I got there later into OMB. And I replaced Jim Schlesinger. That was the idea. Schlesinger was moving on to higher office in the executive branch, and so the slot for national security and international affairs was coming open.
So you had the national security aspect of
Yes,
OMB.
defense budget, State Department,
Okay.
foreign aid,
Okay.
Export-Import Bank, all of those agencies. And naturally, it wasn't just budget, it was also, to a certain extent, legislation. So,
Super. Well, let's go to Fred, and we go to a picture, the only color picture that we have. We've broken through
Who was that young
the
fellow?
barrier. And that's Roy Ash and Fred Malek, because Fred is deputy of OMB. But that's not where you started. You started as deputy undersecretary of HEW.
Right.
And you were responsible for trying to put order in chaos of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And you did such a good job, they made you head of White House personnel. And we've done a forum on the professionalization of the recruitment process, which is a separate forum that features Fred. And just to summarize what Fred said was there's a huge difference between people, and George alluded to this, who campaign and people who can govern. And what ordinarily happens is the people who brought you, the successful campaigners, want spots in government. But what you really ought to do, and this was Fred's innovation, was go recruit people you really want to run the important parts of government. And he got the big headhunting firms to loan him top executives for 6 months to teach him and his personnel group how they went about recruiting. And Fred turned that whole thing around, and so you were head of White House personnel, and then in the second term, you took over as deputy of OMB. Right. Now, how did they convince you to do that? You told me last night when we rehearsed, you told me last night that you wanted to go home. You'd been there for 4 years.
Well, I had been there for 4 years, but I was also pretty dedicated to Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
one of his great visions was the new federalism, which meant that he wanted to delegate more decision-making, more responsibility to the cities, the states, the local agencies. And the way I got to the White House in the first place was my work as Deputy Undersecretary. One of the projects we had was to simplify the grant and aid process and to delegate more decision-making to the states, the localities, and the local agencies.
Closer to the people.
Closer to the people. And Dwight Inc., who later served with George, identified us, he was then at the BOB, what we were doing as sort of the poster child for what ought to be done for this. So we came in, I came in with two of my people and made a presentation to the President and the Cabinet. George, you were probably there. And on what we were doing and to execute this great vision of the new federalism. I was essentially a manager. And I think that became more appreciated by this presentation and what we've been able to accomplish. I was not a political person at the time. I was a manager. And after my stint at in the personnel office, I was ready to go back to the private sector.
That's where you came from. You were a businessman when you got there.
Sure, I'd run a company manufacturing pliers and wrenches and all kinds of exciting things down in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And I was ready to go back and maybe move out to California where my wife was from or elsewhere and get back into the private sector track. But I became very intrigued with the whole concept of managing government and the OMB. I admired so much what George and what Ken had achieved in getting it started. And then I became very closely aligned with Roy Ash during that period after the election when we were staffing up the new government. I worked fairly closely with Roy to get him acclimated as well.
Okay.
And they made me an offer that was very attractive. The offer was that Roy himself wanted to focus on economic policy and the development of the budget, and he was going to have an office in the West Wing, and he would delegate to me many of the responsibilities for recruiting people to the Office of Management and Budget and managing the Office of Management and Budget. That seemed like just a great, interesting, intriguing challenge for a young man of 35 or 36.
Yes, indeed.
And so I accepted that.
And you got the palace in the old EOB. Now,
Yeah,
viewers who follow this,
Thank you, George, for setting the precedent of being in the West Wing, because I got the palace.
the old executive office building was designed to hold the entire executive branch. When it was built, it was called the Swan Building because it headquartered State, War, and Navy. And if you picture, it's really
Timers call it the old state building.
yes. If you picture it as it's a figure eight, but on one side where the Vice President Agnew was the office of the Secretary of the Navy. On the other side, looking out over 17th Street, was the office of the Secretary of the Army. And at the end, looking toward the Washington Monument, was the Secretary of State. And the major entrance, you had entrances all around, but the entrance off Pennsylvania Avenue, which looked over Pennsylvania, the official entrance, on the second floor was Fred's office, which was gorgeous. It had this 5 or 6 different sets of redwood done in a triangular pattern. You remember they refinished
Really
the floor?
reason why he took
That's
the
why he
job.
took the job, because the floor was so he could mop up the floor with the other bureaucrats. And I mean, I remember walking into that office. It was huge, and it was the craftsmanship that went into that, and not just the skill of the occupant.
Well, that was the high point of my having the office, yes.
Well, now what we're going to do, we've talked about how these people got there. We're going to run through very quickly what we think are the key documents that future researchers will come across, and we'll just mention them because they were explored in more detail in earlier Nixon Legacy Forums. What we want to get to, and we'll stop when we hit that, is what George found when he got there and what he went about doing to cause change. So let's go through these. George alluded to the Ash Council. The Ash Council was appointed by President Nixon in the first week or two of his administration, and its original charter was to review the executive office of the president. George said there were 100 people reporting to the president. You can't govern that way. And
It showed, incidentally, his realization that while you have the function of setting policy and all that, you also have to manage the center first.
Yes.
And you can do it better or worse, and it makes a huge difference.
And management was people.
Management is people and organizing them and motivating them and so on. But you have this huge enterprise and you've got to make it work
Yes.
and do what it's supposed to do. Oftentimes people lose sight of that. They go to Washington and think it's all about policy. Well, that's important, but you also have to run things.
And what the Ash Council was, 6 people, and we did a separate forum on this, but it was Roy Ash, the president of Litton Industries, which was the fastest growing company in America, one of the early conglomerates, Fred Kappel, who was chairman of AT&T, the largest company in America, John Connolly, 3 times governor of Texas. This is where President Nixon got to know John Connolly, the dean of the Harvard Business School, a key partner, Dick Paget, in Crescent, McCormick and Paget, a great big consulting firm out of New York, and a man named Walter Thayer, who was president of Whitney Communications. And they wrote the president 14 confidential memos suggesting reorganization, one of which became what ended up as Office of Management and Budget. But it's worth for researchers to find the memo which calls it in their recommendation the Office of Executive Management. What you need to do is consolidate in the executive office this organization to really ride herd on the cabinet departments and agencies. And this was the recommendations of the Ash Council, and it had a far greater role than the National Security Council or the Domestic Council. They were going to make policy. What the Office of Management and Budget was going to help execute policy through budget and management. And then you get to the proposal that led to the creation of OMB. We talked about this before. President Nixon got legislation reenacted that let him submit reorganization plans. And we traced this before, but the first plan was 1939. Roosevelt put it in, and it created the Executive Office of the President. Then it was renewed under Truman.
I just interject.
Yes, sir.
As an old Secretary of the Treasury, that what he did was take out of the Treasury management things that the Treasury had developed. Because the Treasury had to finance the government.
Surely.
So secretaries of the Treasury, well, we got to know how much we're going to spend, so let's worry about the budget.
Right.
They created what amounted to the Budget Bureau. And what Roosevelt did was just move it over
Remove
into
it
the
from
executive
it.
office.
Treasury was
Which
one of
was probably the right thing, because anything that's going to touch other departments, it's better to do it out of the White House rather than one of the departments.
Treasury was one of the first 4 departments, and its whole career, over 200 years, is giving away power. It used to have the post office. It used
Power
to-
was taken away.
taken away
They
from
never-
the Treasury.
They should have the Coast Guard.
You bet.
We wouldn't have these problems in the Secret Service now. if they were
It had the
still in
Secret
Treasury,
Service.
believe me.
It had the post office. That was a Treasury
We're always
function
glad to
too.
let somebody else do it.
All right. So this is the proposal to create the Office of Management and Budget. It's called Reorganization Plan Number 2 of 1970. And the way the legislation worked, and it only existed for the first 2 years of the Nixon administration, as with others, you could reorganize. You couldn't create a department or agency, and you couldn't destroy one, but you could rearrange the pieces on the table. And if Congress didn't veto it within 60 days, it became law. And this went into effect on July 1st, 1970, creating the Domestic Council and OMB. And so it sprung into existence. And this is dated July 7th, I've read these. And this is the President's briefing paper to go to George Shultz's first staff meeting. These are the suggested remarks for the President to make at that staff meeting. And this is the picture. Now, interestingly, this picture is taken in the old EOB. This is, I'm told, by Paul O'Neill, that this is room 248. And this is really the career staff of the Office of Management and Budget the week it was created. And then what you get to, and that's the list of people who are there, and then you get to a memo written that same day by Andy Rouse of the Ash Council, and he's saying to George Shultz, the new director, you're going to have to make some structural changes to this new organization to have it function. And we've isolated Two things. One was allocating many, many more people to the management function and going up to 1/3 of the people. And what I find, and this is highlighted in the yellow box, it suggests, it urges the secretary to create 16 new positions for presidential appointees. And the way the government is paid, there's civil service grades, the top 3, I think it's still this way, 16, 17, and 18 are called super grades. And then above that are presidential appointments, and they're level 1 through 5. 1 is the cabinet, 5 were the younger people that like me who stumbled in. 16 new presidential appointees to OMB, and Andy's memo says because you're going to have heavy enough people to go toe-to-toe with cabinet heads and departments and discuss management and budget issues. And so OMB got this ability to recruit really, really interesting people. And we have a picture of some of them. This is with George in the Oval Office about a year later. And I'm going to run through them, and then we're going to go to George and have George talk about his challenges when he took over. But starting on the left, it's Dick Nathan, and then it's Don Rice, and then Arnie Weber. Arnie was the management of OMB, George, and the president. And to the president's left is Cap Weinberger, the first deputy. Then Sam Cohen, Mr. Budget. And then we have a draft choice later to be named because we aren't quite sure who that person is. To his left is Dwight Ink, and then is Jim Schlesinger, who preceded Ken Dam in doing national security affairs for OMB. But George, tell us what your thinking was when you first took over OMB, what you saw as your challenges, what you thought you should accomplish.
Well, obviously, you have the budget to do. That's essential. And it's really a terrific job because you see the whole federal government in one piece in front of you. But then the M in OMB was new. So Arnie Weber, who was a close associate for many years, he became the first M.
Okay.
And he struggled at it. And gradually we learned, where is clout?
Yes.
Clout belongs to the people in OMB who are the budget officers over X department or part of a department. Those are the guys who have to get convinced that they should allocate a certain amount of money to that.
They control the purse string.
They control the purse string, so if you want to get clout, align yourself with that.
Okay, money
So
talks.
this dawned on us. And so the way Arnie organized the M part was to do it in close collaboration with the budget people. So it wasn't as though there's budget and there's management. You saw that if you were going to be effective in getting these managerial reforms, you better go through somebody who people will pay attention to.
Okay.
So it's always this business of an organization chart is one thing, but actually working, making it work, and doing something is something else again.
Now, Fred, who was head of personnel around this time, said that you recruited most of these people, that he wasn't involved in imposing people on you or making suggestions. This was from your career that you knew these people.
Some of them were, I inherited some. Jim Schlesinger was there when I arrived, but he was terrific. But Don Rice, let's take it Don Rice. Don Rice got his PhD from Purdue University.
Okay.
And when I was dean at the University of Chicago, he was one of the hot tickets on the market, and I tried very hard to hire him.
I see.
To come to the University of Chicago.
Okay.
And what he did was he wound up going to the Pentagon. So I didn't get him.
I see.
Then I'm sitting in, I think, in the Situation Room on some meeting, and Don shows up.
Representing the
My light
Pentagon.
went on. I ought to get him to come to OMB.
Sure.
So I did. But I knew him well from earlier days.
Okay.
And he was a star in OMB. Then he went on to head the RAND Corporation.
And he was a young man when he went to the Pentagon?
Yeah.
Very. They had a program, because I was involved, run by the controller of the Pentagon, whose name escapes me for a moment, but he later ran Ashland Oil in Kentucky. And the best people out of the business school who were going to go in the military, who were in ROTC, could serve their 2 years in the controller's office as he struggled to get a hold of the budget. And Hank Paulson, later to become Secretary of Treasury, went right out of Harvard Business School to the controller's office. And so did Walter Minnick. And then we, just like what you did on the domestic council, we stole them from the controller's office.
Stole is not really.
Stole is not the fair word. We
We
offered,
gave them a new and broader opportunity.
we gave them better flooring on in the old EOB.
Anyway, that's an example of Don Rice. Arnie Weber,
Yes.
when I was on the MIT economics faculty, he was a PhD student.
Okay.
And then I moved to be dean at the University of Chicago.
Uh-huh.
So I got Arnie to join me in Chicago. And then we did a lot of things together there, particularly working with Clark Kerr on the armor automation
Sure.
committee. I learned a lot about discrimination in the workforce there. And so Arnie then, we did a lot of retraining work. Then Arnie came when I was Secretary of Labor as the Assistant Secretary for the job in manpower training.
Oh, I didn't know that. He was at Labor with you.
And then when I moved to OMB, I said,
Come on along.
he's a brilliant guy,
Uh-huh.
really good. So he came over that way.
Let's go to Ken now. Ken, you came in to do national security issues.
Right, I replaced Jim Sussin.
And what was your menu, and what were the budget issues and management issues?
Well, the big issues were budget, and I got less involved with management because I was dealing with some pretty established departments like the Department of Defense.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the budget issues came from the winding down at that point of the war in Vietnam. And so the question is, obviously no department likes to have a budget cut.
Right.
But Roy Ash agreed to that, but we had a lot of differences, I think, between OMB and I said Roy Ash, I'm sorry, Mel Laird.
Yes, of course. He was Secretary of Defense at the time.
Secretary of Defense. So
Yes.
there were a lot of questions about how fast to wind down the military budget, having gotten fairly large during the Vietnam period.
But
And-
not only Mel Laird was the secretary, but the deputy secretary was David Packard.
Yes.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
Mel had recruited because he knew how to run something big.
You bet.
And let me tell you something, Dave Packard was in charge.
Yes.
So when you had to deal with Dave, it was tough.
Well, it was tough, but it was very agreeable because he was very substantive person,
Uh-huh.
and that was a good relationship. There were differences with Ash simply because with Roy, I'm sorry,
With Mel.
Mel, excuse me, because he was a politician,
Absolutely.
a congressman.
Yeah.
He knew how to handle all type of Washington issues, which I was fairly new at
Sure.
because I came out of the academic background. Before that, I'd been a lawyer. It worked because there were differences. The differences, however, were more what you would probably call management. They were organizational issues because we were pushing, and with some support within the Defense Department, of more consolidation of
Okay.
activities, and
Okay.
that's where we ran into some problems with the uniformed military, who didn't really want to be reorganized. They had done things
Their way.
for so long, and there were some.
This is like the fighter that would be purchased by both the Air Force and the Navy?
Well,
sort
there
of
were
thing?
that kind of thing, but it was more getting together, taking things out of the services
Okay.
and moving them really to the the policy
Secretary of
level
Defense's
in
office.
DOD, which would involve then interaction and joint decision with the National Security Council, sharing responsibility and authority. And there was a lot of pushback.
Well, you brought up the National Security Council. I can imagine going over to the NSC and talking to them about budget and management issues. What was that like?
Oh, that was pretty agreeable. I think Phil O'Dean was in charge of that, part of that.
On the NSC side.
Yeah.
But did they come to you? How did those discussions occur?
Well, they were invited into, it was very important to invite them into discussions at the top level of OMB about these things.
Sure.
And their staff to be apprised of what was going on. And of course, we had, well, that was a little later, a lot of policy issues when George moved to his Treasury White House responsibilities.
Sure.
And I was working with him in that, but that was not the OMB period.
There was talk at the time, when we were winding down the war, of the peace dividend.
Yes.
That we were going to have all this money for domestic programs because we weren't going to be fighting the war anymore. And I remember Pat Moynihan said, and I think he said it at San Clemente, the Western White House, that the peace dividend was as effervescent as the morning clouds over San Clemente, and there really wasn't going to be any money, that we weren't funding the war out of current income. We were deficit financing because it wasn't a permanent part of the budget. So there really wasn't going to be this extra money.
George was more involved in that than I was because that was kind of a top level
But we
dialogue.
we used a concept that had become popular among economists.
Mm-hmm.
And the concept was, you want a balanced budget, but the key is to have the budget balanced when the economy is operating full tilt.
Okay.
If the economy is operating less than full tilt, it's okay to have a deficit, because it'll be a little stimulative.
Yes.
Not huge, but it's some. And you don't want to have, if you have spending too high, if you have too much of a surplus at full employment, you're going to have a big problem.
Okay.
So we had the concept of the full employment budget.
Yes. Yes.
And among the things that produced was a little extra money.
Interesting.
So Nixon liked it. And so did, I remember I presented it out at San Clemente. And Nixon and Kissinger's listened, it's like a stone dropping. It was just bang.
It was, wow,
It was
this is a
extra
good
money.
thing.
So I remember we developed in OMB, we developed some thoughts about how this money could be spent in the DOD.
Right.
And I remember going over to Dave Packard and he looked and he said, well, that may be what you think. But let me tell you how I think.
But what was remarkable was that it wasn't necessary to use too much muscle to cut the defense budget. We had a target, believe it or not, of $250 billion, and it actually turned out at 236.
That was the whole budget.
Yeah, and the defense part came down very rapidly, almost by itself, despite Mal Laird's, which I think was not invented here, attack or approach that he would decide.
Right.
And we had nothing
Right.
to say about it.
Almost with his buddies on the Hill.
Yeah, exactly, because he had very good relationships on the Hill. He'd been a congressman and he
Sure.
was very well connected.
So he could get his budget through the Congress with no trouble at all. You guys were in the way.
But the momentum of reduction of activities abroad and so forth brought the actual spending down
Okay.
as fast as we would have liked it to have come down, but we couldn't get agreement that it was going to come down to that
It
level.
just did it anyway.
It just happened.
Well, when
Is that
So we
your
had
memory,
a
George?
goal of holding spending to $250 billion.
Okay.
And we said any outfit ought to be able to get along on $250 billion.
Okay.
Even the deficit these days gets lost in that.
Yes, it does. Yes, it
It's
does.
It's
And it's
awful.
not all
It's
inflation
awful.
either.
No. Well, when President Nixon took office, there were 535,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. And when he was reelected in 72, it was down to under 2,000. And within a year of that, it was below 250 soldiers, and that for the end of his term. So and I assume they weren't being repositioned into Korea or Germany, so we were letting soldiers go like mad.
So there were two issues with the Defense Department. One was the overall budget.
Yeah.
And Laird's idea was he would decide.
Yes, of course, his budget.
But there were some also consolidations and so forth that have been worked out more at the OMB staff level.
Okay.
With some agreement from the Defense Department. And our problems were more with the services who didn't want to be
Sure,
told what
sure,
to do. So it was a kind of a triangular relationship. OMB, White House, the cabinet level people in defense, and then the military.
In the
And
career.
that was rather complicated,
Okay.
but it worked.
Okay. You also had jurisdiction over some other organizations in national security, the CIA.
Yes,
How did that work?
that worked extremely well. For some reason, the then director of CIA decided that his best strategy was to be very agreeable and very friendly with OMB, and I got a lot out of that. I learned a lot about not just the budget, but the clandestine services and all kinds of things, because he wanted me to understand the culture
Yes.
of the CIA and the intelligence community.
And that wasn't Dick Helms, that was his replacement.
That was,
Kobe? Or, no.
There was a moment
sorry.
when President Nixon said to us in OMB, said, I want to see the whole intelligence budget in one place.
Uh-huh.
There's some over here and some over here and some over here. So I want it all together where I can see the whole thing and see what our priorities are and whether they're the right priorities.
Uh-huh.
So we undertook that. And the result was the intelligence people decided we must be important. So I remember they came around and said, hey, we do this every day, we give the president this brief. We're going to give it to you. I said, oh my God, what a deal.
The President's Daily Brief.
Yeah.
Sure.
But after I read it for a couple of months and it's all heavily classified,
Yeah.
I said, most of this I really am getting from the newspaper. I don't, this is just putting a muzzle. If I say anything, I'm violating security. So I said, stop.
Stop
Don't say
giving it to you. Now, we think
let
of
me just
the,
add that I was very impressed with the staff of OMB and how much they knew. First of all, there was a joint process at the staff level on the defense budget. So our staff people were very clued in with what the staff people in the Defense Department were talking
Okay.
about. We had some really outstanding career people. I remember NSA was one of the agencies.
Sure.
And the staff guy knew the NSA people very well, went over there a lot. He took me over there. I found that basically an open door. They were not going to tell me highly classified secrets about exactly how they did things.
yes,
But it was a very good relationship. And I attribute that to the quality of the staff people in OMB.
so,
Ken is making a really important point here, namely that throughout the federal government, there are these career people. And these people have a lot of talent.
They do.
And they have been around and they've seen things come and go.
Mhm.
And as a cabinet officer, say, you come in, if you don't take advantage of that, you're out of your mind. There's somehow this notion that they're
against
opposed
you.
to us. I was told when I became Secretary of Labor, the Department of Labor is a wholly owned subsidiary of the AFL-CIO. A Republican can't get anywhere. Well, I made friends with George Meany for one thing, but I found when you give people leadership and you act like you really want to get into these issues in a professional way, they'll knock themselves out for you. And that's true in OMB, it's true in the Treasury, it's true in the State Department. So anytime in governance, you have a system, as we're having currently, where the decision-making doesn't have access to these career people, you're not going to get as good decisions as you could get.
Because you won't have the information and the economies
So
of
when
being
everything
established.
becomes too White House-centric, you don't have access to those people.
Not only that, it becomes all politics all the time, because a lot of the White House people don't have experience in the different areas. They have a
campaigners.
lot of experience in politics.
Yes.
And that is not healthy.
But I would add something. Remember, I was much younger than any of you, youngest lawyer on the staff. I think what worked so well for you at Labor was you knew what you were doing when you got there. If we had picked someone who we just needed to have in charge that didn't have a grounding in that area, then you can't go toe-to-toe or have have thoughtful discussions with the career staff because you're not bringing anything to the party. You're just listening.
Yeah, but you should certainly look for people to appoint to these posts.
Absolutely.
who
No,
know
it comes back-
something.
it comes back to people.
That gets back to your recruitment.
Yes, it comes back to people. It's not just pick somebody because they look like they come out of central casting. It's pick people of substance who know the areas before you put them there.
Right.
I want to hit one thing back with Ken, because to me this is important. The CIA budget is secret. We, the citizens, don't know what's going on. But it wasn't secret from OMB.
No, not at all.
And it wasn't they weren't accountable for the money they were spending.
Not only was it not secret, but it was broken down in great detail for us. And there was a joint, I think I alluded to this, but let me be explicit. OMB and the Defense Department had a system whereby the whole budget was gone over jointly in a joint review before it ever got to the White House level.
Okay.
And so the working level people, fairly high civil service level people, knew each other intimately, and they were friends and they shared information. So there were no secrets among them about what was in the budget and so forth. That was very important.
Okay. I want to do one more thing before we get to Fred, and that's put up a chart. This is an organization chart that researchers will find in the file for July 15th, 1970. That's 2 weeks after OMB came into effect. And you want to comment on the validity of this organization chart?
Forget it.
Forget it.
Yeah.
Because?
Well, because to get things to work, yeah, you have an organization chart, but it's about people
Okay.
and how you do things. Like President Nixon's insight that the place where you have your important meetings has an impact on people's mentality. Like we found that you could have a box that says management, but it's pretty sterile unless it marries itself to the budget directors who have some clout and knowledge.
Okay.
So the chart is interesting, but it doesn't really tell you the story of governance.
And I bring this up because this is important to me. We had the exact same discussion about a week and a half ago with the early people on the National Security Council staff. We had a chart of what the NSC was supposed to look like, and they said that the chart's not valid. Yes, that existed, but nobody followed that. It was done on the basis of people and how it worked together. And it wasn't management by walking around, but it was the interplay of knowledgeable people, not what was on paper. And that brings us, I'm going to go back to Fred. We have a picture of Fred and Roy in color. I can hit it right away. There we are. And you got there at the beginning of the second.
Who's that guy with the big swath of hair coming down the side of his face?
A good-looking young man he is.
Yeah, he's got sideburns. Yeah, kind of a hippie kind of guy.
That's what you wore when you were 36 years old those days, Jeff.
Yeah, well, and had a beautiful floor in your office that was
Yeah.
you were 36,
I think I was 36 then.
and you took over as deputy director of OMB.
Right.
And the concept you
I might have
brought,
been 37, actually.
well, that's okay. We won't quibble about that now. And the concept you brought with you, the concept you wanted to bring to lend authority to what OMB was doing.
Well, I'm not sure whether it started under when George was director or whether we started it, but what we did is we took the budget and the management and we combined it under 4 different associate directors. So you would have an associate director, for example, for domestic areas who would have both the budget and managerial responsibilities under him or her.
Okay. And was it the classic 4? National defense, natural resources, human resources, and community development? What
Better
we
get
did?
economics in there.
And
It was
absolutely.
economics. Community was with human resources,
Oh, okay.
and the economic departments were separate.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you consolidated, what George said, you had to have the budget
Yeah,
involved.
you'd have an associate director over, let's say, human resources and human or community resource or whatever we call it.
Okay.
And that person would be responsible for the development and execution of the budget, as well as for the setting of objectives and the management issues that related to those departments. So they were combined.
Okay.
So this person had great clout with the departments because he did have
He had a big
purview
stick.
over the budget. Exactly.
And the people that George brought with him, when George went to Treasury and moved on to other things, there was a changing of the staff in the second term, and you recruited a whole bunch of new people.
Right.
And we don't have a picture, but you have their names in mind.
Well, we did recruit new people, and what I wanted to focus on the managerial aspects of it because I felt that that's what the president wanted me to do.
Mhm.
And so I recruited people who had particular expertise in management, in the management arena. They didn't have the substantive background in depth, I don't think, that George's people had, but our thesis was that they would learn that. So,
Okay.
for example, we brought in board John Sawhill for natural resources. John really didn't have a background in that, but he was a terrific manager.
Mhm.
As evidence of that, later after he left the OMB, he became the president of New York University.
Yes.
In the area of national security, we brought in a fellow from McKinsey and Company, a partner of McKinsey and Company named Dolph Bridgewater.
Uh-huh.
Dolph did a terrific job there. Again, he didn't have great national security creds, but he did have managerial competence, and he was able to learn enough to be effective.
Okay.
He later became CEO of the Brown Group, which is a huge manufacturer of shoes and other kind of footwear
Mhm.
in this country. Paul O'Neill was at the OMB, as I think we just promoted him to the position of associate director.
Paul was career civil
He was a
servant.
career civil servant who gave up his career civil service status. Maybe it was under you, or I'm not sure if it was under
I
us.
remember he was it's just this young fellow, and he comes and he makes a presentation, and he said, wow,
Yeah,
he's hot talent.
very, very smart
So
guy.
He
And
moved up.
And he became, when he left, after some years, he became CEO of Alcoa. So
Yes.
I think we had pretty good talent. And then we had a fellow named Wally Scott over the economic area. Wally had been the partner in charge of Lehman Brothers in the Chicago area, and he was over the economic area. And he later became CEO of a major mutual fund complex. Frank Zarb had a portfolio of management activities that didn't relate directly, that kind of crossed all the lines, and he later became CEO of Smith Barney and then of a major insurance company. And my executive assistant, not to leave anybody out, was
Yes?
Colin Powell.
And there's a White House fellow.
He was a White House fellow. So we had a great team, and our mission was really to take the president's priorities and to ensure that they were executed both in a budget and managerial way.
Mm-hmm. And there's a phrase I'm trying to move you toward.
Management by objectives.
Yes, that's it.
what
You ring
want.
the duck comes
That's what
down,
you
we
want.
said the bell. Let's talk about it, management by objective, MBO.
Well, our view was that it wasn't enough to have grand aspirations. You had to codify these grand aspirations and break them down into specific objectives that you wanted to achieve in the department. Objectives that would include sub-objectives, timelines, responsibilities, and in that way you could measure your progress against those objectives and you could hold people accountable for achievement. And we felt that this was commonplace in business, in many businesses. We had learned it in business, and we would try to execute this across government. The key was to ensure that they weren't just our coming out and imposing objectives, but the departments and agencies took ownership. And I must say that the cabinet officials that we dealt with on this were truly giants. I mean, we had people like George Shultz at Treasury. We had George Romney
At HUD?
at HUD, Elliot Richardson at Health, Education, and Welfare. We've talked about Mel Laird and Packard at Defense.
Earl Butts, agriculture?
John Volpe, former governor of Massachusetts, at Transportation. We had people of great substance and presence and achievement who had great qualities. If you go in and say, this is your objective, we're giving you this is what you have to do, well, I don't think it's going to work. So what we did is recognizing the fact that it had to be their ownership, recognizing the fact that we were young people trying to get cooperation from giants of American politics, industry, and so forth, that we would go to the departments and we would work with them and we would mold the president's aspirations into objectives that they would create themselves and take ownership in with our assistance.
Kind of tell us what you're here
Just
for.
a
and what
little
you-
insight.
Yes,
You
sir.
mentioned outstanding people, and you mentioned Earl Butz, who was Secretary of Agriculture.
Yeah.
He was a great showman.
Yeah.
He was under pressure once because food prices were high and the farmers are responsible. So he goes to a congressional hearing and he has a loaf of bread wrapped in its usual wax paper. And he takes off the wax paper and throws it aside. He says, the farmers don't even get as much as the cost of that wax paper. All the costs are somewhere else.
Processing the bread.
So get off my back.
Yeah.
And get off the farmer's back.
Interesting. Interesting. I remember Bryce Harlow, giant of a man, even though he was vertically challenged. He was very short. Told me once that the position of Secretary of Agriculture is a very, very sensitive position because we're moving away from a farm economy. And this is very, very touchy. And he said, let me tell you, you don't want to let go of your current Secretary of Agriculture until you've got a really good grip on the next one. Because it's hard, that's a very, very hard position to fill, because you have to say no to farmers. And saying no to farmers is not a popular position.
Yeah, but it's also true that in the Senate, each state gets 2 votes,
Yes.
which means that small states, which often tend to be agricultural in nature, have a disproportionate voice.
Yes.
So you better pay attention to agriculture, pal.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well, I know it's a tad off subject, but no nation, in my view, shepherd on the world, has successfully moved away from its huge political reliance on its agricultural community. When you start to remove things from the farmers, the agricultural people, you threaten the whole government. I mean,
Food supply.
food
Makes a
supply.
difference.
I mean, it is key, and yet with agribusiness and genetically engineered crops and things like that, we don't need as much land
Right.
in agriculture. And America's blessed with incredibly fertile agriculture. So it's a difficult issue. But you'd go to, back onto the subject, you'd go to agriculture and say, if these are the 5 things that we've agreed you want to accomplish, let's talk about how we get there.
Exactly. I'll give you an example. And it's kind of hard. My memory is not as profound as George's and Ken's after more than 4 decades, I must tell you. But I can give you 1 or 2 examples.
Sure.
I think the best one occurred at Health, Education, and Welfare, which houses the Food and Drug Administration.
Okay.
The President Nixon, had declared war on cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his overriding objectives was to get cancer treating and curing drugs through the FDA process faster so they could help patients who were in danger of dying, who had
Yes.
contracted this dreaded disease. And it took forever, still takes forever, I believe, to get things through the FDA. So one of the overriding issues was
Move this fast.
move it faster.
Yeah.
So you go to the Secretary of HHS, and at this time HEW, Elliot Richardson, and you talk about this objective, and you talk about how you can break this down into sub-objectives with timelines and responsibilities and accountability for speeding up the process. What are the elements that you need to speed up? Who are responsible for those elements? How can they be speeded up responsibly without endangering the public? How do you need more manpower for this place? Do you require less manpower over here because of that?
Where are the bottlenecks were?
Where are the bottlenecks? And let's develop a plan that has the sub-objectives, that has the responsibilities, that has the timeline, and every couple of months, we're going to wander over here and let's have your FDA commissioner in. Let's talk about where we are on these things
Okay.
and how we're doing. And if we're not on schedule, why not?
Okay.
And what can we do about it? How
Okay.
can we help you get it done? But that's the kind of approach that we took to try to take the president's priorities, the president's policies, and get them to be adopted by the departments and agencies and executed in a way that we actually achieve something rather than just talked about it.
Okay. I want to wade into the thin ice here, walk out on thin ice, and bring up two subjects and get your reactions. Because I've said, without fear of contradiction, that before Nixon, you had something called cabinet government. And the president appointed the secretaries of the cabinet, and they did what they chose. And they made their decisions, and the people on the White House staff basically read about it after it came into effect, unless it was huge and they discussed it with the president. But that with President Nixon, he didn't control the Congress. 2/3 of each house was in the hands of the opposite party, so he couldn't confirm all of his own people. The career civil servant organization had grown hugely under the Great Society program, and they had different attitudes on government from President Nixon. So we instituted these changes in the executive office of the president, and after the Nixon administration, you had a different organization because you had consolidated policymaking into the White House itself. National Security Council, Domestic Council, OMB, and a very strong chief of staff. And while the cabinet had input, it no longer made decisions on its own. And that the foundation for the modern presidency that enables a president to actually control the executive branch occurred because of these 4 organizational changes. Now, is that a fair analysis of what happened? Or what is it better to say, no, the cabinet still controls, and if you let the White House get too much power, you mess up because they're just kids.
I think you're taking it too far. I don't
Fair
think,
enough.
I don't
No,
think
that's-
it went that far. I think it was a joint effort between the cabinet departments and the White House to develop these policies, as I recall it. I served at HEW for a year and a half,
Mhm.
and we did not feel that we had policies and legislative initiatives imposed. It was rather jointly developed, because they didn't have all the answers. When we were in the White House, we didn't have all the answers. There was a lot of expertise, and to George's point earlier, there's an enormous reservoir of talent in the career bureaucracy. And instead of treating them as the enemy, if you bring them in and consult with them and take advantage of their expertise, they can be enormously helpful.
Well, I will add one thing. George is too kind to point this out. When I make this case, there's an asterisk that says, of course, that doesn't count George Shultz because he was so good at labor. And he was allowed to do anything he wanted because he had a private deal with the president on what was going to happen in the Department of Labor before he took it over.
I don't think it applied anywhere, Jeff. I mean,
Fair enough.
you were
No,
at the
that's what
Domestic
we're talking
Council, and of
about.
course, you guys had a lot of impact on the policy development. But I felt that departments had a tremendous amount of responsibility for
Okay.
policy
George?
Yeah, I think it works well when everybody is aware of the fact that the policies are always the president's policies.
Okay.
When I was Secretary of State, people asked me about my foreign policy. I don't have one.
Mhm.
The
The
president
president
has one.
sets the foreign
My
policy.
job is to help him formulate it and carry it out, but it's his policy, not my policy.
Okay.
So that's where the authority is. He's the guy who got all.
The only elected officer.
However, I think to take what you described, I think it has gone to an extreme now, where everything is in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And you get people who are czars over this, that, and the other thing, deciding stuff. They have no access to the career people. They're not going to carry anything out, or if they try to, it'll be a catastrophe because they don't have that kind of, the operations have to be carried out by the departments.
Mm-hmm.
So a much better idea is the idea that President Nixon had, namely, that you see the different subjects that the government is going to work on. You identify the departments that have leading roles in those subjects. You form them into little councils, and they work directly with the president to develop policy and then carry it out. So it's the president's policy, but worked with the cabinet officers who are also accountable. They can be called to testify at any time.
Okay.
And then we made a proposal like that when I was director of OMB, really carrying through on the ash things. But it kind of died with Watergate. didn't go anywhere. However, he put it into effect in the economic arena. And when I became Secretary of Treasury, he said, keep your office in the White House and be assistant to the President for economic policy.
Yes.
And when you're going to have a meeting among people from other departments, have it in the White House. Your Treasury meetings are in the Treasury. So that's the way it proceeded, and it worked very well.
With you as that assistant.
Well, I was doing it, but it worked well, and and this is another government insight on his part, that if he gave me a job, and I did everything out of the Treasury Department, it wouldn't work. Because people would resent that, one department over another. However, if I'm sitting in the White House and they come to the White House for the meetings, it changes it in a desirable way.
All right. Properly chagrined, but I'm going to venture one more time because I think it's important for this to be discussed.
Well, you got out on thin ice.
Yeah, no, I'm still out
Still
there.
ice, but you fell through a little.
I fell through it. I'm doubling down. I have described OMB as the president's enforcer. OMB has not just budgetary power, but it has legislative clearance. No department or agency can testify before Congress without OMB seeing it and signing off. And when they're talking about a law going through or a new proposal, there are 3 levels of clearance, at least there used to be. I don't know what it is now. You could testify, and everybody looked for this. It was really in the first paragraph of the testimony. It was a part of the policy of the president. It was consistent with the policies of the president, or it was in conflict with the policies of the president. And only OMB could award that criteria. So it didn't matter what EPA thought on acid rain. You know, there's a proposal on acid rain. It's going through the Congress. EPA's going to testify. What do you think? OMB's imprimatur was on the top. And second thing, or third thing, there's a budget, there's legislative clearance, and there's regulatory clearance. No department or agency in those days, and I believe through to today, could issue a regulation without OMB blessing that regulation. And I've taken the position, I understand you may not agree, that that's what enables the president to act or control the executive branch, that OMB, if push comes to shove, has the upper hand. How do you think?
Well, but you're right. In effect, they do have the final say, but it's a collaborative effort before it even gets to that point. It's not the president saying, this is my policy, and the OMB is saying, this is what you're going to say, or saying yes or no. It's a collaborative effort between the department, the domestic counsel, the OMB, in order to get to the point where it comes before you. And then you look at it for a final kind of sign-off before they go to, they would submit the testimony or go to testify. But it's not dictatorial, it's collaborative.
That's a very important point, and it fits with this general theme. That you can have boxes on a chart or have authorities there, but how does it really work? In order for it to work, you have to have a dialogue. You have to work it out. And sometimes if you get somebody who wants to go way off the reservation, well, then you go to the president and say, look,
Right.
this is not your policies, and in the end, he's in charge.
So he can make the exception, but nobody else can.
Maybe he doesn't want to make an exception.
Maybe he doesn't.
There's a point that you alluded to before, which I think is quite important. There's been a tendency in the last 30 years for the White House staff to grow. And the OMB is the president's staff.
Yes.
But they are disciplined, they have a process and so forth. There are people who just show up on the president's staff and start doing things are not subject to that discipline.
Okay.
And I think that is counted for some tendency in that direction, is counted for some of the problems that more recent presidents, particularly the president now, has in getting buy-in from the departments and from the career people. because there's not that discipline in the process.
They said last week that there were 30 or 40 people on Henry Kissinger, substantive people, on Henry Kissinger's NSC, and there are now 1,700 people on the National
There's
Security Council.
1,700 on the National Security Council?
1,700 people.
Yeah, but that's a bad mistake.
No
My
question,
gosh.
no question. And that it can't make decisions because it's become the bureaucracy.
Well, furthermore, you hear the National Security Council head goes and leads a delegation somewhere. That's not the role. That's the
Absolutely.
Secretary of State's role.
Yeah, that's, what we're
And I
talking about
remember
is
when
the,
Colin Powell became the director of the NSC staff,
yes,
he came to me and he said, "George, I'm a member of your staff.
yes,
The members of the NSC are the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, and the secretary of defense.
and that's it.
And they are entitled by statute to military advice, and there is a staff. And obviously, the president is the key guy the staff serves, but the staff is supposed to serve the other. So the head staff guy is saying, I'm not a line person, I'm a
Right.
staff person.
Right.
He had it right.
Fair enough, fair enough. We're going to end, but I want to give each of
Colin
you,
Powell said something when I left office, and he had been the national security. He said, the national security staff director and the secretary of state haven't gotten on so well since Henry Kissinger held both jobs simultaneously.
what a rare compliment, well, and deserved. I'm going to let each of you have a final say, if you think we've missed a topic or you want to emphasize something, and then we'll bring this to a close.
No, I don't think we've missed anything in terms of the period we're talking about, but I think that in those days, there weren't as many outlets to the press and media through the internet and so forth. And I think in judging later presidents, one of the problems is there's just no discipline, because staff people can create their own constituencies in the press and on the internet and so forth. And so there are many more voices out there, and there are many more places that people go on the internet and so forth to get their information. So I think we were to a certain extent blessed by the fact that there were 3 networks, and there were the
Yes.
evening news shows, and there was a press conference, which was a big
No-
event.
no
of the
Twitter.
day, for the press and so forth. Today, there's 1,000 leaks, some authorized, not authorized, people making policy for themselves. So I don't know whether that's the result of technology or the result of presidents being unwilling to impose discipline on how things operate within their sphere.
George?
I would underline the importance of 2 words. The first one is strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the characteristics of President Nixon was he had he had substantive strategies, but he also had a strategy toward the subject of governance. And that's what we're really talking about here.
Knowing what he wanted, knowing how he wanted it to
Right.
do it.
And then governance is the second word I would underline. And organization charts are okay, they give you a starting point, but you're trying to get something accomplished. And Fred has talked about the importance of figuring out how you're going to organize things so that people can be held accountable.
Mm-hmm.
There's some objective out there, and you can see whether they're doing it or not, and so on. And that's how governance will work. And I'm afraid I'd have to say right now in our country, we don't seem to have much of a strategy, and we don't seem to be paying attention to governance.
I picture President Nixon as getting up each day wanting to accomplish things, to do things. I mean, some of them were first, but he had a program, the result of a lifetime in public office, and time to think about it in between being in public office. And each day that stuff wasn't accomplished was one day less that he had to accomplish what he wanted to do. That he was pulling the rest of us along with him. He wasn't presiding in the classic sense of waiting for problems to come to him. That there was very well thought out leadership going on. And that was a huge difference from other situations.
Yeah, but problems come at you.
Absolutely.
And you're not in charge of them, they
No.
come to you.
No,
And
they
you've got to have yourself set up that you understand the problem, realize you've got one and what is it, and then you can
Then
do
deal with it.
something with it.
Fred?
Well, the difference, I think, is that President Nixon did have a strategy, and so when the problems came to him, he would have a basis, a more fundamentally better basis for making the decision because he had a strategy of where he wanted to go.
Okay.
And that included his strategy for managing the government, which he understood. He understood not just politics and policy, but he understood the importance of applying business management principles to the federal government in a way that would hold people accountable and ensure that he would achieve his policy objectives.
Fair enough. And thank you for coming and participating in our forum. And thank you for listening. That ends our program for the day.